Imani Asghedom was only 10 years old when her father was taken from her, shot down in broad daylight in front of his own store by somebody he actually knew. And ever since that day, this little girl has had to grow up faster than any child ever should. 10 years old. That's 5th grade. That's still believing the world is supposed to be fair. That's still needing your father for everything. For homework help, for advice, for somebody to tell you that everything is going to be all right. And in one Sunday afternoon, all of that got ripped away from her permanently. But what people don't talk about enough is what happened after. Not the trial. Not the sentencing. What happened to Imani? How has she been moving as she's gotten older? And what has she allegedly been saying about the man who pulled that trigger? Because word on the street is that Nipsey Hussle's daughter isn't just grieving anymore. She's on a different type of time. And by the time this video is over, you're going to understand exactly why and exactly what's allegedly been going on. Stay locked in because this one gets deep. Before we even get into Imani's story, you have to understand who Nipsey Hussle actually was, not just as an artist, but as a father and as a man. Because the full weight of this story only hits when you understand exactly what was lost that Sunday afternoon in March. Herman Joseph Asghedom was born on August 15, 1985, in Los Angeles, California. He grew up in the Crenshaw district of South Central, one of the most historically underserved and overlooked neighborhoods in the entire country. The environment he was raised in was not designed for the kind of success he eventually built. Gang activity, poverty, and a school system that wasn't built to support kids like him, those were the conditions. A lot of people who come up in that kind of environment either get consumed by the streets entirely or find a way to use their talent to escape. Nipsey did something that very few people in his position ever actually pull off. He came up through those same streets, kept every one of his roots, and then turned around and committed himself to pulling the whole neighborhood up with him. His Marathon clothing store on Crenshaw and Slauson wasn't just a business. It was a philosophy made physical. A statement that said, you don't have to leave your neighborhood to create something meaningful. Neighborhood to build something significant. He used to sell his early mixtapes for $100 a copy. Not as a gimmick or a flex, but because he understood scarcity, value, and ownership at a level most people his age weren't even thinking about yet. He was partnering with tech companies and opening co-working spaces. He was actively purchasing property in Crenshaw because he wanted the people who lived there to actually own the blocks they called home. He was having conversations about generational wealth and economic independence while simultaneously making music that connected with people on a level that was real, raw, and personal. The man operated like a CEO and a community organizer at the same time. And he was genuinely making progress on both fronts. That's the full picture of who Imani's father was. Not just a rapper, but a builder and a visionary with a specific plan that was actually working. And he had 2 children. He was building all of it for his son, Cross, with his longtime partner, Lauren London, and his daughter, Imani, from a previous relationship with a woman named Tanisha Foster. Imani was born in 2008, which made her just 10 years old when her father was murdered in March of 2019. 10 years old. Still at the age where your dad feels invincible. Still at the age where the people you love seem permanent. Still at the age where you need your father for everything and don't yet know what life looks like without him. By every account from people who were close to Nipsey, he was deeply involved in Imani's life. Despite the complicated nature of his relationship with her mother, he made sure his daughter was surrounded by family. He made sure she knew who he was and what he stood for. He made sure she felt his presence. People who knew him well have spoken about how seriously he took fatherhood. Providing financially was the floor, not the ceiling, for what he wanted to be as a father. He wanted to actually show up, to be present, to be the kind of father his children could feel in their daily lives, not just see on a screen or read about in an article. He understood from his own upbringing what it meant to grow up without that foundation. And he was determined that Imani and Cross would never have to feel that particular kind of absence. And then, on a Sunday afternoon in March of 2019, he never got the chance to show up again. March 31st, 2019. Nipsey was outside his Marathon clothing store on Crenshaw Boulevard, doing what he always did on a regular afternoon, being in his neighborhood, accessible and connected to the community he came from. Neighborhood to build something significant. He used to sell his early mixtapes for $100 a copy. Not as a gimmick or a flex, but because he understood scarcity, value, and ownership at a level most people his age weren't even thinking about yet. He was partnering with tech companies and opening co-working spaces. He was actively purchasing property in Crenshaw because he wanted the people who lived there to actually own the blocks they called home. He was having conversations about generational wealth and economic independence while simultaneously making music that connected with people on a level that was real, raw, and personal. The man operated like a CEO and a community organizer at the same time. And he was genuinely making progress on both fronts. That's the full picture of who Imani's father was. Not just a rapper, but a builder and a visionary with a specific plan that was actually working. And he had 2 children. He was building all of it for his son, Cross, with his longtime partner, Lauren London, and his daughter, Imani, from a previous relationship with a woman named Tanisha Foster. Imani was born in 2008, which made her just 10 years old when her father was murdered in March of 2019. 10 years old. Still at the age where your dad feels invincible. Still at the age where the people you love seem permanent. Still at the age where you need your father for everything and don't yet know what life looks like without him. By every account from people who were close to Nipsey, he was deeply involved in Imani's life. Despite the complicated nature of his relationship with her mother, he made sure his daughter was surrounded by family. He made sure she knew who he was and what he stood for. He made sure she felt his presence. People who knew him well have spoken about how seriously he took fatherhood. Providing financially was the floor, not the ceiling, for what he wanted to be as a father. He wanted to actually show up, to be present, to be the kind of father his children could feel in their daily lives, not just see on a screen or read about in an article. He understood from his own upbringing what it meant to grow up without that foundation. And he was determined that Imani and Cross would never have to feel that particular kind of absence. And then, on a Sunday afternoon in March of 2019, he never got the chance to show up again. March 31st, 2019. Nipsey was outside his Marathon clothing store on Crenshaw Boulevard, doing what he always did on a regular afternoon, being in his neighborhood, accessible and connected to the community he came from. No massive security detail. No barriers between him and the people he grew up around. That was always intentional. That was part of his identity as a person. He consistently refused to let success make him unreachable or removed from the block that made him. And on that particular Sunday, that commitment to staying grounded and present became the thing that cost him his life. Eric Holder showed up that afternoon. What makes this so particularly painful is that Holder wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone from a rival neighborhood. He wasn't some unknown threat. He was someone from the same general circles as Nipsey, someone they both knew, someone who had been around. The two had a conversation that afternoon, and from what witnesses described and what prosecutors laid out in court, that exchange revolved around Nipsey confronting Holder about being a snitch. In that world and in that community, there are few accusations more serious, and Holder apparently couldn't let it go. Here is the detail that reveals exactly what kind of person Eric Holder is, and exactly why what he did constituted first-degree murder and not some heat-of-the-moment reaction. After that conversation, he left. But he didn't walk away from the situation. He went and got a gun. And this is the part that tells you everything you need to know about his mindset. He changed his shirt. He specifically and deliberately put on a red shirt to make himself harder to identify clearly on surveillance cameras he already knew were positioned in the area. That is not an impulsive act. That is planning. That is thinking ahead. That is making a decision and then taking deliberate steps to execute it while also trying to minimize the evidence trail. That calculated preparation is exactly what separated this legally from manslaughter and made it premeditated murder. He thought it through. He equipped himself. He came back. And then he walked up to Nipsey Hussle in front of his own store and opened fire. Multiple shots at close range. Nipsey was struck at least 10 times. 2 other men who were nearby were also hit in the shooting. And then Holder turned and ran to a waiting car. He was driven away by a woman he had been with that day and disappeared into the city. Nipsey was rushed to the hospital. He did not survive. He was pronounced dead, and within hours, the grief that swept through Los Angeles and the entire hip-hop world was something that remains difficult to describe even years later. People gathered outside his store in tears. Artists posted tributes from every corner of the globe. Community members who had been directly touched by his work and his presence stood in the streets trying to process something that simply refused to make sense. Because this was not just the death of a musician. This was the interruption of something real, active, and working. A man in the middle of changing his community, gone because of a snitch accusation that Eric Holder decided he could not walk away from, because of a bruised ego that he turned into a murder weapon. That is what Imani lost her father over. That specific, preventable, completely unnecessary thing. Not a war with deep roots. Not some unavoidable consequence of the life he chose. A grown man who couldn't handle a confrontation and made a choice in a matter of minutes that would define the rest of his life. The LAPD moved quickly. Surveillance footage was released almost immediately, and it didn't take long for people who knew Holder to put a name to the face seen on the video. His identity was confirmed publicly within 24 hours, and his face was everywhere. News channels, social media, wanted posters, across the entire city. The manhunt that followed was one of the most high-profile investigations the department had launched in years, but it ended faster than most people expected. On April 2, 2019, Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies located Eric Holder in Bellflower, standing outside a mental health facility on Artesia Boulevard. Reports say he had actually called the facility himself, saying he needed help. Whether that was a genuine moment of crisis or a calculated move to establish a mental health narrative ahead of his arrest and eventual trial, nobody can say for certain. What is certain is that he was taken into custody that afternoon without incident. Just 2 days after the shooting. The trial that followed took far longer. Pandemic-related delays pushed the proceedings back significantly. It wasn't until July of 2022, more than 3 years after the murder, that Eric Holder Jr. finally sat before a jury in a Los Angeles Superior Court. 3 full years. 3 years of Imani getting older, moving through middle school, and trying to navigate adolescence without her father while the man responsible for his death sat in county jail awaiting trial. When the trial finally got underway, the prosecution came prepared. Surveillance footage from multiple camera angles documented Holder's approach, the shooting, and his retreat. There was eyewitness testimony from people who were present and saw everything happen in real time. There was forensic evidence tying Holder to the scene. And then came the moment that truly strengthened the case. Holder's girlfriend, the woman who had been driving the car that day and who had first-hand knowledge of everything that happened before and after the shooting, took the stand for the prosecution and testified against him. The person closest to him that day. The person who helped him leave the scene. She told the jury everything. The defense leaned heavily on a mental illness argument, pointing to Holder's documented history of mental health struggles and his appearance at a psychiatric facility as evidence that he was not mentally capable of the level of premeditation required for first-degree murder. But the jury looked at the shirt change. They looked at the deliberate return. They looked at the calm and calculated actions captured on camera. The premeditation was simply too clear to ignore. Guilty on every count. First-degree murder. 2 counts of attempted murder. Firearm-related charges. And a sentence of 60 years to life. Eric Holder Jr. will likely spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. That is the end of his story on the outside. But for Imani, the verdict did not bring closure. There was no moment when healing suddenly began because a sentence had been handed down. Because when that gavel came down and 60 years to life became official, she still didn't get her father back. She got confirmation that the man responsible was being held accountable. And she still woke up the next morning without him. The justice system functioned exactly as it was designed to. The loss remained exactly what it had always been. In the immediate aftermath of Nipsey's death, the question of who would raise and care for Imani became urgent. Her mother, Tanisha Foster, was not in a stable position to provide consistent custody. Legal proceedings regarding Imani's guardianship began, and Nipsey's family, particularly his sister, Samantha Smith, stepped in and fought for guardianship through the court system. Samantha was ultimately granted legal guardianship. Imani went to live with her aunt, surrounded by the Askadam family and by people who had known and loved her father throughout her entire life. From the outside, that sounds like the best possible outcome in a devastating situation. She was safe. She was with family who loved her. She was in an environment where her father's memory remained alive in everyday life, not just on anniversaries. But imagine what that environment might feel like from the perspective of a grieving 10-year-old child. Every room you walk into is shaped by his absence. His music might be playing in the background at any moment. His photographs hang on the walls. People visit partly because being close to his family feels like the closest they can get to being close to him. Her father wasn't just her dad. He was Nipsey Hussle, which means her grief has never been private. Every year on March 31st, the internet floods with tributes and her father's name trends globally. Every time a new documentary is released, an old interview resurfaces, an artist samples his music, or invokes his name in a verse, the wound is reopened on a public scale that she has zero control over. Most children who lose a parent get to grieve in their own time and in their own space. Imani has had to grieve with the whole world watching since she was 10 years old, whether she wanted that or not. She has been photographed at memorials, seen at events honoring his legacy, and watched as family members and people in the Hussle circle kept her father's memory alive publicly. And as she has gotten older and started developing her own voice and identity separate from simply being Nip's daughter, people who pay close attention have started noticing a shift in the energy. The grief is still present. Something like this never truly goes away. But there is something harder sitting alongside it now. Something more focused. Something more specific. What some people claim, based on things that have allegedly been said or expressed in certain circles, conversations, and sentiments that have made their way into public consciousness through social media and word of mouth, is that Imani's feelings about Eric Holder have crystallized into something beyond simply wanting him to remain in prison. Something more pointed. Something that people familiar with the environment she grew up in recognize immediately when they encounter it. To be completely clear about something important, nobody is alleging that Imani has done anything or taken any direct action against anyone. That is not what this conversation is about. What this is about is the emotional reality of a young woman who grew up in a very specific environment, lost her father to highly public violence at 10 years old, and has been living inside the weight of that loss every single day since. That is the sentiment people are picking up on. Those alleged statements and emotions are worth examining because they reflect something genuinely human about what a situation like this can do to a person who had absolutely no say in any of it. Now layer on top of all of that what has allegedly been happening to members of Eric Holder's family since the murder, because this is where the story takes on another dimension entirely. The streets of Los Angeles did not simply sit back and wait for the justice system to process Nipsey's death and then quietly move forward. That is not how South Central operates. And anyone familiar with that environment understands this without needing it explained. Nipsey wasn't just beloved in his neighborhood in some abstract or surface-level way. He was claimed. He had deep loyalty from real people who felt his murder as personally as losing a member of their own family. Because in many cases, that is exactly what he was to them. And when someone that deeply embedded in a community is taken the way he was taken, the response from the streets is rarely just grief. It's grief mixed with something else. Something that courts and sentencing hearings have no jurisdiction over. Reports began circulating not long after Holder's arrest that members of his family were being targeted in retaliation. Those reports did not fade as months passed and the case moved through the legal system. They intensified. Social media posts, videos circulating in certain online communities, and conversations happening in the streets all pointed toward the same claim, that people connected to Eric Holder had been killed since Nipsey's death and that retaliation was the reason. The framing remained consistent throughout. The streets settling a debt that a prison sentence could never fully balance. Now it is important to separate what is confirmed from what exists only in street narratives. Those are two very different things, and confusing them helps no one. What is documented is that there have been deaths involving people connected to Holder since 2019. What no law enforcement agency has officially stated in any public record is that those deaths were specifically orchestrated as retaliation for Nipsey Hussle's murder. That official connection does not exist in the public record. No detective has held a press conference and drawn that line directly. But in environments where these events occur, many people do not believe official records tell the entire story. They look at the timeline. They look at who was involved. They look at the connections. They look at the pattern. And they arrive at conclusions that feel self-evident to them, even without formal confirmation. Rapper Brick Baby, who had real proximity to the situation, publicly addressed some of the circulating reports and pushed back against the more extreme versions of the story. He suggested that certain claims were exaggerated and pointed to Holder's father reportedly having law enforcement connections as a factor that may have provided some degree of protection to the family. But even Brick Baby's pushback acknowledged the core reality that the sentiment itself was very real. People in that world felt retaliation was the natural and expected response. Many did not believe a courtroom verdict alone settled the debt. That is the environment Imani grew up in. She did not create it. She did not choose it. But she was born into it. And she lost her father to its most brutal expression.